The Manitowish Waters Historical Society hope you enjoy this interview of Judy Ilg Peterson. Judy was born here in the Northwoods, a Dr. Kate Newcomb baby. Judy is the granddaughter of the late Joe Ilg Sr., who settled on Rest Lake at the turn of the century. Here, Joe is standing on the left with his family. They stayed in tents during the summer. This is the view of the Ilg Resort in the winter. As you listen to this interview, learn about Judy and how her family decided to make Manitowish Waters their home, how life changed over the years, and how they adapted. This interview was conducted on Tuesday, July 21st, 2020, by me, Janelle Cole, Manitowish Waters Historical Society board member, and John Hansen, Vice President of the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. Hello, today is Tuesday, July 21st, 2020, and I'm here with Judy Ilg Peterson and also John Hansen. I'll turn the camera just a little bit to see John. And then my name is Janelle Cole. I'm the librarian here at the Frank B. Koller Memorial Library, and we are interviewing Judy today. And Judy, when and where were you born?
Tomahawk, Wisconsin.
Tomahawk.
By Dr. Kate.
Oh, by Dr. Kate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There aren't too many Dr. Kate babies remaining. Oh my goodness. And who were your parents?
Joe and Esther Ilg.
Were your parents from Tomahawk? Can you give me a little background of, since you were born in Tomahawk, can you give me a little background of where you were all from?
Dad was born in Oak Park, and my mother was born in Chicago, both from Illinois.
Okay. And at the time that you were born, where did your folks live?
We were living in Chicago, but my mother and father were helping my grandparents with the resort here in Manitowish Waters.
And who were your grandparents?
Joseph and Leonore Ilg.
Okay. And what was the resort's name?
It was called the Joe Ilg Camp, and then it was called the Joe Ilg Resort.
Oh, the Joe Ilg. And was that located, or is that located?
Well, currently, I guess it would be off Ilg Road on Rest Lake, between Rest Lake and McCabe.
Okay. Do you recall when your grandparents would have acquired?
At the turn of the century.
1900. Yes. Okay. And it's still in your family, but it's not a resort?
It's not a resort, no.
Okay. So what did your grandfather do?
He was a solicitor for the Grand Trunk Canadian National Railway, and his territory happened to be the Chicago stockyards. And so he worked with the meatpacking companies all over the country.
And how did he find his way up here?
I'm not sure, Janelle, that I have the information correct, but my understanding was, and if I remember hearing the stories, he was interested in the land after Weyerhaeuser had clear cut. And I believe, maybe John can help me on this, I think the land was rather cheap at that point. And my understanding was that my grandfather had received a small inheritance from his father, who was a pharmacist. When he died, Grandpa and his sister, Aunt May, received a small amount of money, and there was a desire to take a look at northern Wisconsin. And working for the Grand Trunk Canadian National Railway, he had a pass for the Chicago Northwestern. So he'd come up on the Chicago Northwestern, and in that way he acquired the land.
Wow.
And I think there were a couple other variables that played into this, not only the cost factor, but my grandmother had, 5 children, and the one daughter that was born in 1901 lived to be 8 years of age and died. And I think that my grandfather was eager for his children to enjoy fresh air. They never knew the cause of death. One day she was in his arms taking a nap and didn't wake up. And it was devastating for him. In fact, they never mentioned her name after her death. She was apparently a very lovely child. In fact, I have her obituary, and I have a number of little things that she did. She was quite a crafts girl. And at any rate, it was very, very hard on the family. And I think my father felt like the fresh air of northern Wisconsin would be good for his other daughters. And then he had 2 sons. The sons were the youngest, my father Joe and his brother Robert. And I think he wanted to get them out of the urban area. He wanted to have them come north. So they actually I think he acquired the land as a family compound. I don't think he ever thought that they would have a resort. It was a family compound, and it was mainly to escape the industrial area of Chicago that was, of course, at that time very industrial. And he just thought it would be healthy. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And they lived in tents.
Oh. Now when you came along later, do you recall how much time did you spend up here? I mean,
Well, my parents lived in Chicago after I was born, and then my brother Joe was born about 2 years later. And we lived in Chicago, and my father, it was during the war, and my father worked as a tool and die maker in a factory in Chicago. And Mom and Dad had a real generous streak. They not only had my brother and myself, but they had my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and they had my maternal great-grandmother, and Oma and Grandma Dawn. And they lived with us, and then there was a tragedy. My aunt and uncle, my mother's sister, was killed, and her husband in an automobile accident. And they had 2 boys, David and Paul. Paul and I were the same age, 3 and a half, and David was 8. And Mom and Dad decided that they wanted to raise them. They didn't want them to go to an orphanage. And so with that news, we always came up about 2-3 weeks each summer. And I still remember standing in line in Chicago with my mother getting our train tickets. Trains were very popular then, like airplanes are today. And we'd come up, and of course we absolutely loved it. And as my grandparents aged, they felt that it would be wonderful if Mom and Dad could raise all of us in the Northwoods. But it was also to help with the resort, to actually take over the resort. And so that's how it all came about.
Do you remember what year that was when you moved up here?
I'm 81 right now.
Oh, okay.
And I was 8 years old.
Okay.
So it was in the 1940s.
It was in the 40s, right before World War II. Or during World War II, I should say.
World War II.
Yeah. And what do you remember about moving? What sort of, did you miss certain things from the city to up here, when you moved full time?
We've always loved Chicago. In fact, I have to admit that right now I'm having a difficult time as to what's going on in Chicago. We absolutely loved Chicago, and Mom and Dad always provided a wonderful life for us. In Chicago, on the weekends, we'd have a picnic, and we'd go to Grant Park, or is it Lincoln Park, and then we'd wait until nighttime, and then we'd go to Buckingham Fountain and watch the colors, lit on the water, the fountain water, and it was so beautiful. And we used to do that almost every weekend in the summer. Yeah, we had a very nice life in Chicago, so it was something to miss. But of course, look at all the wonderful things we can do here.
And it had to be really quiet up here. I mean, being up here all the time, then it had to be an adjustment.
Well, we didn't have a car. I had a bike. It's very amusing to me now, all the bicycle trails. I rode on 51 and W in the gravel.
Yeah, that is a change. And then traffic too.
In fact, I was telling the folks at Little Bohemia, I became a Girl Scout. And of course, you know, Girl Scout cookies are very famous. But the cookies that we sold in that day and age came from a big brown box. I think it was a bakery in Manitowish that had baked them, and they delivered them to our home. And Mom and I would package them in brown bags, and I'd fill my basket on my bike, and I'd go hurrying down to Little Bohemia because Mr. Winnetka was my favorite customer. He'd buy all the cookies and give me a bonus for the Girl Scouts.
I had no idea that the Girl Scouts were going at that time.
Well, in fact, when we see the Girl Scouts selling cookies outside our stores in the Washington area, I always give them a little bit of a donation and tell them that I bet you can't believe that an old lady once was a Girl Scout. In fact, Mrs. Ilg was our scoutmaster, and she had Ilg's Grocery, which is now the location where Veronica McGraw has her beautiful design center. Mr. and Mrs. Ilg, they were just lovely, lovely people. Mrs. Ilg was a wonderful Girl Scout mistress, master, whatever.
Do you remember who else would have been with you in Girl Scouts?
Oh, Carmen Burkowski, Susan Voss, Nancy Ellis.
And what else did you do besides that at that age to, you know, or entertainment and?
Well, it seems like a lot of the entertainment centered around family. My mother was an extremely capable woman who not only was very efficient with her family and running the resort with my father until he became a master plumber and worked for Mr. Cherney on the powerhouses in the Upper Peninsula. And so while Mom was very efficient in that respect, she also was very community-minded. And I remember they asked her if she would become a member of the PTA, soon the president, and she realized no one would come to the meetings, so she said, well, we have to do something about this. And so she started planning programs, and they started filling the auditorium with the programs that she was able to provide for the community. So you see, the community wanted some sociability as well. And then she went to my grandfather one day and said, and I think John has heard this story many times, she said, you know, Joe, she said, we have 9 taverns in town and we don't have a church. And he said, well, Esther, you get your girls together, and if you can figure it out, he said, I'll give you the land for a church. And so that's how the church came about.
And that was back?
It was in the late 1940s, early 50s.
And is that the Presbyterian church in town?
Community church.
The
yeah.
community church.
And actually, Mom has an interesting history in that she, in growing up, her father, and it's interesting when you think of it in the perspective of this time, died of the Spanish flu. And my grandmother raised 3 of her children alone. And my mother was the middle child, and she began to take violin lessons from Mrs. Alderman. And because Mrs. Alderman knew the situation in the family, my grandmother was a seamstress, and so she went out, and actually she was a seamstress for Marshall Field and Company. And she went out to work and had the children at the same time. And of course it wasn't what women have today, and yet a lot of it is still the same in terms of childcare. At any rate, Mother started playing violin, and she was first chair in her high school orchestra. and they asked her to play in the Women's Symphony in Chicago. And but they were of an economic situation where she had to work, and so she went to work for the railroad, Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and she worked for Mr. Snell, who was the executive of the railroad at the time. And he was very upset when she met my father, and my father brought her to northern Wisconsin. He lost his secretary, and many people said, Joe, how can you do this? She needs to stay and play with the symphony. She needs to play her violin. As a result, she played music here in the community, and before they had the church, the Daniels, I'm sure you're familiar with Mr. and Mrs. Daniels. Mr. Daniels started the post office. Mrs. Daniels was a musician in her own right, and so they planned a beautiful Christmas program each year, which they held in the gym at the school, a lovely Christmas program where it was all music. And my brother, David, was a piano player. He played the piano, Mom would play her violin, and Mrs. Daniels gathered a chorus together. We all would sing for her. And it was a lovely Christmas show about the story of the Christ child. And in fact, one of the most beautiful scenes was Mrs. Engel. Our teacher was Mr. Engel, and they're both still alive. I think he's over 100 now.
105.
105, and they've been married all these years, but Mrs. Engel was the Mary. And she was a beautiful Mary. And I remember that scene so very, very well from the Christmas pageant. So there were lots of things going on, and then of course movies came into being, and the PTA worked very, very hard to raise money through bazaars in the summer to buy a projector for the school to be able to have movies. But then of course you just can't have movies in school, you have to have movies for the community. So they had Laurel and Hardy, Abbott Costello, all those wonderful, old, crazy, funny films. And then, of course, we'd make candy and cookies for intermission. And then also, that brings to mind the skating parties in the wintertime. They'd freeze the ice at the school skating parties, and we'd have hot chocolate. I still can see my father carrying a hotel tray, because they had served meals at the resort, carrying a hotel tray with about 30 cups of hot chocolate, which the women had prepared in the kitchen. And so there were lots of things going on all the time. And then, of course, they had bazaars in the summertime. In fact, John mentioned the other evening when they brought the Miss Wisconsin pageant to the Northern Lights, which is across from Aurora Borealis. That was that beautiful hotel, and brought the Miss Wisconsin pageant. And I remember the women from the PTA provided all the goodies. And then, of course, and maybe you already know about this, the kitchen band. Did you ever hear about the kitchen band?
I've seen pictures. That looked like a lot of fun.
They had a wonderful time, and they went all over the state playing. They'd be asked to play in summer fairs, and the women would.
Oh my.
And people often said, as you said just now, Janelle, it's amusing when people say, well, what do you do? It's up to you. There's a lot you can do if you want to.
Yes, being very creative, for sure.
Right. And then my parents were very much of the work ethic, so we had to have jobs. And then we also had the situation of, in running the resort, when my grandfather ran the resort, he had the wherewithal through his employment to provide for hired help. And in fact, Mr. Christensen, who would shop, was one of his helpers. In fact, Grandpa was very sorry when he decided to develop his own place, because he was a wonderful help. And my grandma and Grandpa were thrilled to have Mr. Christensen. At any rate, Grandpa had that type of help. When Mom and Dad came, my father didn't have employment like my grandfather had. So we kids had to work the resort, and then Mom and Dad insisted that we have jobs outside the resort. And Joe, my brother, absolutely loved working for Hanson Hardware. his favorite person in town was Millie Hansen. He often said to me as an adult, he said, Mom, she was the loveliest, or Judy, she was the loveliest woman. And I worked at Jaeger's Resort Shop, which was a beautiful, beautiful resort shop. I think we need a Jaeger's Resort Shop.
And what was it about Jaeger's that you enjoyed? You worked in a
Well, Mrs. Jaeger had 3 stores in southern Wisconsin. And Mr. Jaeger, I believe, if I have the story correct, it could be an error. I believe he had a heart attack, and so they decided to close shop in southern Wisconsin. They came up here, and I think they built a home. I think they owned their own home. And she decided that they'd open a ready-to-wear store. And I've forgotten Rita's last name, but Rita was their first employee aside from themselves. And Rita eventually went on to work at the bank for a number of years, Lakeland Bank. And I'm sorry I've forgotten Rita's last name. At any rate, then after Rita left, I was 13 when I started working for the Jaegers. And Mrs. Jaeger had a marvelous ability for selection of clothing. And, excuse me, she, what would you say, her mantra in the store was Pendleton. And of course that's out of Oregon. So we had Pendleton, Jansen, White Stag, beautiful clothing. And then she had contact in New York City, actually, Neiman Marcus, and also, what was the, Bergdorf Goodman. And we'd have cashmere from those places, Lady Manhattan shirts. And it was, for me, it was a very interesting experience because I had clientele from Deer Park Lodge, Wass's Resort, Kerner's, and many people who were up here, as John and I were talking the other night, where mothers, women, wives would come up with their children for the entire summer, and then the husbands would commute during the weekends. And I guess that's still going on, but I think it was quite popular years ago. So many of my customers were women who would come in who were here for the summer, and then they would leave at the end of the summer, and of course they'd come in and buy clothing for the fall and winter. It was a lovely experience. I worked there for 10 years through high school, and then when I went on to college, and then for 1 year in graduate school.
And where was this located, this store, the shop?
Well, initially it was on the, what I would call the north end of LaPorte Grocery. And then, of course, LaPorte Grocery burned down. And then the Jaegers had their shop at the south end of LaPorte Grocery. And I believe that became the country, was it the country?
Village Soda Grill.
Well, at first there was a clothing store, wasn't there, John?
Yeah,
and then the Soda Grill, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's changed names over the years. It's been different
Yes.
businesses over the years, right there.
And the Jaegers would come here in the summer, and then they would winter in Florida.
And
Actually, a little bit aside from this, but it's been fun with my grandchildren. When I started working for Mr. Jaeger, I was just excited to have a job. And I made $24 a week. And I worked 8-hour days. But Mr. Jaeger said to me, Judy, I'm going to give you Social Security. And I didn't know what Social Security was. Well, my grandchildren now have jobs, and one of the first things I say to them is, do you have Social Security? Why, Grandma? And I said, well, right now, your college fund that I've been working on since the day you were born, all my Social Security goes to you. And I said, you can thank Mr. Jaeger.
Mm-hmm.
I often thank him. I look up in the heavens and say, Mr. Jaeger, you were wonderful to do that.
Who would have known, right?
Who would have known?
And so your brother worked where again?
Hanson's.
At Hanson's, that's right. So you two were both pretty busy during the summer, and then
We enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We felt fortunate.
Did you have something that you did, say, in the evenings with friends in the Northwoods that?
Actually, we had a lot of entertainment going on at the resort. You know, as I was commenting to Chris Conley, who helps us now at the place with grass and weeds, he does a beautiful job, and he was over this morning, we were visiting, and I said, you know, it's really interesting. We just kept working, and at night it was a matter of entertaining our guests. The guests came first, and I said, when we moved to Seattle, and Nordstrom's mantra is the customer comes first. For Mom and Dad, it was always the guests came first, and so that was it. That was our activity.
And then all winter you would have school, and John was in your class, or you had the
John
one
was a
room?
little older.
I'm
weren't you?
older, yeah, probably 2 years.
Actually, I was commenting the other night, well, actually, my husband is working on canoes right now, that my grandfather, one of them is a Carlton, which my grandfather gave to my grandmother on her birthday in March. And Charles has been working on the canoes, and he needs to have the seats caned. And is it Frances Whitfield?
Mhm.
Whitfield does caning, and so Charles contacted her, and I said, I believe that she in some ways connected with the McFarlands, and John McFarland and I sat together in the little semicircle at the community school my entire grade school career. It must have had something to do with the initials of our last names or whatever. And John always would tell me he was going to be a physicist, so I just assumed he was going to be a physicist.
Oh my! And did you? Which high school did you end up going to?
Hurley.
In Hurley. Okay. Okay, and from there,
Went to Carroll College,
okay.
and then got a scholarship to go to graduate school at Syracuse University.
Syracuse. Okay. And and what did you study?
Well, it was mostly the social sciences and education, and it was fortunate because then when I married Charles, he was going through medical school, so I was able to teach at the college level. So I taught at the college level for 15 years.
And all out east.
Pardon?
All out east?
Well, actually, we were east for his medical training, and then we went to the Pacific Northwest for his internship, and fortunately I was able to get positions at colleges. Then we came to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and I was able to teach at Rochester Community College. And then we went back out east for a year, and then down to the southwest, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was able to procure a job there, and then we went to Seattle to raise our family.
All the way around to all the coasts.
Right. But there's something special about the Midwest. Especially now.
And how many children did you have?
4.
4 children. And are they drawn up here to the Northwoods like you've been in your life, your young life?
Well, if you ask them what was the most influential experience they had in their growing up years, they would say being with Grandma and Grandpa in northern Wisconsin.
Is there something they would do with you, something special up in the Northwoods that
Well,
left
actually,
them
I felt
impression?
it was wonderful for Mom and Dad to get. Mom and Dad had begun to retire, I think, at the time when the kids first started coming, and they really started to spend more time with Mom and Dad when Charles was at Mayo's, and it was close. We could drive up, and Mom and Dad were very gracious in offering space for them because we lived in very cramped quarters. And that's, I'm sure, something they really enjoyed. However, I wasn't quite sure I wanted my mother and father at that point in their life to have to feed my 4 children. So fortunately, I not only taught in the winter months, but I taught through the summer, and I'd send them my paycheck so that they would have money for food. I said, Mom, if you can tolerate all the bickering that goes on between 4 children, I can certainly pay for your food, right? But they loved it.
Oh,
And then, interestingly enough, as Mom and Dad aged, we had the 4 children. They range in ages. There's about 9 years apart. And so our youngest, who's very energetic and quite an athlete, I said to Mom and Dad, I think Richard's a little bit more than you want to handle. So we checked into Red Arrow Camp, and he became a Red Arrow camper and also a counselor at Red Arrow. And our eldest son, who at the time he would have been that age, we didn't have the wherewithal to send him to Red Arrow. So Charlie applied to be a counselor at Red Arrow when Richard was there, and he was a counselor also. And there again, it's a wonderful experience, and they were very disappointed that Red Arrow couldn't open up this summer. But hopefully they'll be able to stay on board and open next summer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lovely camp.
Mm-hmm. I used to work at Camp Osawa.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
In fact,
back in
I
the
think
80s.
Susan Boss went to Camp Osawa.
Could be.
I think she did, yeah. The boys loved it, absolutely loved it. And we were thrilled that they could have that experience.
Yeah, it's more time in the Northwoods.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Richard said to me, and he called the other day and said, how are things going, Mom? And I said, Richard, I think of you because he'll always say to me, Mom, there's something about the Wisconsin air that I absolutely love. He said, I remember, I'd get to camp, and he said, the air was so wonderful. We have beautiful air out in the Pacific Northwest, but it's not northern Wisconsin air as far as he's concerned. So I said, well, I'm taking deep breaths.
Did you see much change? I mean, the changes that went on from when you moved here as a young child up until, you left for college. Did you see a lot of changes on your road and your resort? A lot more people moving in at certain times over the, say in the 40s or 50s or 60s. Did you notice when more of that went on, more moving?
I think change would be the word to use rather than more or less. It seems to me as though change has been phenomenal, and I don't know, when John and I were talking about change the other evening, I've often said to my family, in fact, as my children compare their experience with Grandma and Grandpa, where the resort was waning and they were retiring and getting older, I said to them, my experience coming to the resort when they had American Plan, there were 13 cottages, they served 3 meals a day, and of course I was just a little kid. I wasn't doing the work, but I absolutely loved it. It was wonderful. We'd ring the dinner bell, and we had a big log house, and they had a dining room porch. French windows surrounded the dining room porch, and Mom always set a beautiful table. And I was commenting to John the other night, the camaraderie amongst all the guests. And in fact, interestingly enough, all of the cottages had different names of families that would come every year, like Anthony Cottage, Bogardus, Sharp, Myrip, Murphy. I mean, these people would come year in and year out for 2-3 weeks, and they would all come for their meals. And the camaraderie, the stories, the conversation, no cell phones, no TV. I mean, and of course, we were not allowed in the dining room, but we could hear the laughter and the conversing. It's absolutely lovely. And it's a lovely memory in terms of what goes on today.
Yes.
I don't know if it'll ever return, but it would be lovely if it could. And my grandfather was a wonderful storyteller. Just a wonderful storyteller. I don't know if anything was true.
That's beside the point.
Now, is that something that you miss your children and grandchildren not having been a part of? Was that kind of camaraderie between visitors?
Probably, I don't think I would use the word miss, because I'm hopeful, a person with hope. I'm hopeful that the experiences they are having are appropriate for them in this time. It's different, but I hope the same enrichment that I felt through that experience, they will have through their experiences. To give you an example, our one granddaughter just wrote the songs, played the guitar, and published her first album, which was put on Spotify and had quite a few hits. And the name of it is Clover. And we were able to hear the songs over Charles's phone. And beautiful, very inspirational. So I think, in a sense, there's a child that has inspiration, but it's in her time. I had a different time.
Yes, you did. Let's see. Look through my notes. Were there certain traditions that you had every year? I don't know, Christmas or 4th of July that come to mind
Right.
as you were growing up?
For 4th of July in winter, Mom would order the fireworks from Ohio so that Dad would make the trough for the Roman candles. And they always had, for the guests at the resort, there were special things they did as groups. And we had a lodge. In fact, Kim Cost was hoping so when we took down all the buildings that we could have saved the lodge. In fact, he was trying to figure out how he could put it on some type of a platform and take it over to the Discovery Center so it wouldn't be lost. And it was made out of tamarack logs, which I guess my understanding is they'll last forever. So he was thinking about taking it apart. In fact, I saw him at the town meeting the other night, and I said, Kim, I can't tell you, every time I look at that spot on the property, I think, oh my goodness, that's the lodge that Kim tried to save. But they'd always have gatherings in the evening in the lodge. And in our home in Seattle, we have the round library table, which was the poker table. The men played poker. And the women, at that time, I wanted my grandmother to teach me how to play bridge, but at that time they were playing canasta. So I learned how to play canasta. At any rate, they would go from the dining area to the lodge and have these fun type activities. Well, then Mom and Dad, when they went from the American plan to the Continental plan, Mom would always have potluck suppers in the lodge once a week for all the guests, and they would have one of the things that everyone loved about Mom was she could bake, and she'd bake these beautiful, beautiful things. And of course, they loved her baked goods at these potluck suppers. Another thing they did, they'd always take the guests one day a week, and they would go up to Black River Falls, Black River Harbor, and then they'd come down from the falls. We'd hit all the falls and be exhausted and hot. And we'd stop in Ironwood at Bridgman's for ice cream. They had the corner store and the best orange sodas and banana splits you could imagine. In fact, when Mr. Bridgman went out of business, it was just a void in Ironwood. And I said to him, Mr. Bridgman, you can't do this. And he said, it's gotten to a point where he said, I can't pay my rent when people buy a Coke and sit for 2 hours conversing. At any rate, we lost Mr. Bridgman, and that was just a special corner and a special event for all of us. So they would do that kind of thing with the guests, and it was a lot of fun.
That changed after a while, did it?
Yes.
Taking the guests, and then you were mentioning the American plan, then going to Continental.
Right.
Was that something other resorts were doing as well, or just something that was the new thing?
No, I think this was related to my father. When Mom and Dad came up, they thought that maybe they could do it on the resort without Dad having to do something beyond the resort. And they soon realized that wasn't possible on 10 weeks out of the year. But they also realized that in serving meals, there was a problem. And they called in a consultant. And the consultant concluded, Joe, your wife is too good a cook, and you're serving family style. They are eating you out of house and home. And then he went a little bit further, and he said, you can make a lot more money pouring liquid out of a bottle than you can having your wife stand over a hot stove. And while my father was not, he was not a radical as such, he said to my family, he said, I can't do it. And he said, because I just do not want to see people make fools of themselves. So they closed down the dining room and they went to Continental Plan. And yet all the people that had come for American Plan came for Continental. And of course, then I suppose, do you suppose, John, that was the seed for our wonderful restaurants in Manitowish Waters?
Could very well be. Yeah.
When the resorts didn't serve meals anymore, I mean, goodness, Manitowish Waters has some wonderful restaurants.
Yes. Yes. And I suppose around that same time, maybe other resorts were changing a little bit.
Well, we
too.
talked the other night about the change a little bit. Here again, this word change, Janelle.
Yeah.
It seemed to me, and I could be wrong on this, but people were very satisfied to come on the train. And I think one of the reasons our resort was always filled, and as I said to John, probably a lot had to do with Mom and Dad, just the kind of people they were. But I think it was the location, because they liked being able, since they didn't have cars, they would walk to the highway. They could go to Millie's shop and look at all of her lovely pewter and pine scented items. They could go to Laporte's grocery, which also had a lot of slot machines, and big minnow tubs. And of course, kids love to watch those minnows swimming in the water. Mm-hmm. And then, as John mentioned, Winnie and Marie, the Windmar was so popular. That was so sad when it burned down. And then you had Rudy List, which is now Parkside. And then the Daniels came in and built the post office. And then Mrs. Daniels wanted a yarn shop. That was the shop next to the post office, which is now, is that the Nines, or it's one of Mrs. Uline's stores.
Yeah.
And then the one of the other stores was the art studio, and then the Ox Show, which yes. And so they enjoyed that, but I was commenting to John, maybe the automobile had something to do with the change in the resorts, because suddenly people thought, well, wait a minute, we want to go up into Canada. Fishing was maybe a little more exciting, plus you could purchase beautiful woolens. I saw that working at Jaeger's. While they liked the Pendleton, and they liked many of the wools we had, they thought it would be wonderful to go up and get the tartans from the Hudson Company, the Hudson Bay Company. And so, it's this idea of adventure, and we can get in our cars and we can go farther. And it seemed to me then, that's when the real estate offices developed a real boom, because resorts started to close and people started to come up to buy cottages and buy land. Suddenly we didn't have our resorts. And I think for me that era is gone. I don't know if it will repeat itself. I just don't know. It'll repeat itself differently. As Dawn was saying the other evening, people are working differently now. But I'm wondering if the virus hasn't been a boom for Manitowish Waters, because people suddenly are thinking, wait a minute, maybe we can work digitally. In fact, I'm just so hoping that broadband will be an entity that will not even be discussed as not being adequate, that it will be something that will just be a part of our daily life here and provide an opportunity for those who might wish to live in this environment maybe forever or for 365 days out of the year, or perhaps spend more time here than they would otherwise. But then you have to be careful what you wish for. But you have a library, and you have Janelle, and you have John, who keeps me.
Yes, everybody keeps things together. Yep.
Well, and it's not so easy to do. Someone said to me the other night, you went to the town meeting. How was it? I said, it was absolutely wonderful. I got to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Where I am right now in my life, and the attitudes are such that we don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. It was very special, John. Very special meeting. And issues were brought up, and people could give differences of opinion, and nobody got angry.
Right.
That's just amazing.
Very nice.
So that's what I say, be careful what you wish for.
No, John, did you have anything to ask Judy that I overlooked on my notes?
Well, you mentioned the starting of the church, and I think it originally was held in the old town hall, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
Which is no longer there. That was over where the cemetery is. So that's where the church got started.
And in fact, in the old town hall, didn't the PTA, I know Mom made curtains, they had summer dances for the kids, didn't
Yes.
they?
Yeah.
Summer dances for
Yeah,
the
I think
children.
we even had them during the school year, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe so, John.
So, yeah, their involvement in the beginning of the church was very significant, and the land donated for the church. So I don't know. I'm just sitting here enjoying listening.
That's,
This has been wonderful, Judy. Is
is
there anything else that you might like to add of your time growing up here in Manitowish Waters, and anything you'd like to advice to give to the audience that will watch this?
I'm very grateful. My husband was asked at one of his reunions, he's a Dartmouth graduate, and they asked him about his life, and his comment was, I'm a lucky boy. And I often say to him, I'm a lucky girl. I feel very fortunate. And I think, Janelle, I don't understand. I have to be very honest with you. I don't understand what's going on today. I don't understand the behavior. I can't comprehend it. And as a result, and I am employed, I am self-employed, I work alone a lot, so I have a lot of time to think. And I can't tell you how often I think about my life growing up here, and my mom and dad and the way they handled themselves. And so in a sense, I am a lucky girl.
So Judy, thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
It's been such a pleasure, and I've learned so much myself.
Well, thank you for taking care of this library. I know Betty would be absolutely thrilled. She was so thrilled that you were here. And when I see this new edition now, oh my goodness, she'd be so happy.
She would be. It warms my heart too, thinking of her and how proud she was of everything,
Yes, isn't that
and how
true?
much use it gets.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Judy.